I read last week this poem, but I want to start with it again this morning. And it says, I will not take that bitter thrust which rent my heart today as coming from an earthly soul, though it was meant that way. But I will look beyond the tool because my life is planned. I take the cup my Father gives. I take it from his hand. He knows and even thus allows these little things that irk. I trust his wisdom and his love. Let patience have her work. Though human hands have brought the sting, I firmly take this stand. My loving Father holds the cup. I take it from his hand. Now those who watch may wonder why these things do not disturb. I look right past the instrument and see my Lord superb. The trials which would lay me low must pass through his command. He holds the outstretched cup to me. I take it from his hand. I start with this again. I don't normally repeat my openers, right? But it fits with where we're finding ourselves once again in the book of Genesis. I think that one of the things that we wrestle with as believers, I know the world certainly wrestles with, is how a God, a good God, a loving God can use or allow or permit the sinfulness of man. And not only that, frankly, how God works it into his ultimate plan for our life. It has led many people to take the faith that they thought they had and to cast it aside because they realize, I can't reconcile these two things and I really don't believe. And even we as Christians, I just finished reading a book by Paul Tripp on suffering. And it was written only a couple years ago when he went through some major health crisis in his life. And even before he finished reading the book, he endured yet another one. And he see his own struggle in there. And as much as that man has influenced and taught the Word of God and is faithful, you see his own struggle trying to reconcile some of these challenges and sufferings that life brings. We wrestle with it. And you don't have to look too far in the pages of Scripture to see others did as well. I want you to turn to the book of Habakkuk. If you can find that, you get bonus points. Book of the Old Testament, a little minor prophet. You don't probably read it much. It's not your go-to book for promises and lift-me-ups and encouragements. But I remember when I was in college, we had a group project to take this book and to read it and to turn it into I don't even remember what the project was. We had to make I don't remember what the point of the project was, but I just remember the message of the book has resounded with me and settled upon my heart ever since then. Habakkuk is one who struggled with this very thing. Beginning in the book of Habakkuk, chapter 1, we see these. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear, or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? Why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, and strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, and so justice goes forth perverted. Let me give you a little synopsis of Habakkuk's cry. He's looking at his own people and the wickedness of his people, and he is bewailing the fact that wickedness seems to flourish, and that justice seems to be thwarted, and the righteous suffer, and God, in his opinion, does nothing about it. Now, I could probably put that in today's jargon, in today's terminology, in today's context, couldn't you? Why does it seem that the wicked flourish and the people of God suffer and justice is thwarted and lies are not caught and wrong is put forth and truth is not discovered, and why do we suffer? And God, why are you not doing anything about it? Well, notice God's answer to him in verse 5. Look at the nations and see and wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, and all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and they take it. They sweep in like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own might is their God. Now what you see happening here is God says, Habakkuk, I see the wickedness of Israel. I got it. I'm bringing the Chaldeans in to punish them. Now imagine that. And Habakkuk is going to respond in chapter 1, verse 12, all the way down through 2:1. He says, wait a minute. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. You who are pure have purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up them ones more righteous than he? You make the mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook, and he drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet, for by them he lives in luxury and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself in the tower and look out to see what ye will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So this dialogue, you have to picture this for a moment. Habakkuk sees the wickedness of mankind and says, why are you not, God, dealing with your people? Why are you allowing this to happen? And God says, listen, I'm bringing in that ruthless, brutal, violent Chaldean nation who will plunge you, who will punish you for the wickedness that I see going on. Habakkuk's like, not the answer I was looking for. He stands back aghast, going, God, you are pure. You can't look on evil. How on earth can you bring a nation more wicked than what I'm complaining about to deal with us? And if you read the rest of the book, this little short book, basically God says, listen, I got under control. I'll deal with the Chaldeans in their time too. Don't worry about it. But you can see Habakkuk here says, listen, I'm just going to stand myself right here, my little self-righteous self, and say, what are you going to answer me, God? Because it's not right. It's not fair. It's not just that you would use a nation more wicked to punish. Habakkuk struggled with this very idea. God, how can you use man's sin in your plan? It's a common theme, isn't it? It's a common struggle. And even the writers of Scripture, did I just lose a microphone? I just noticed a change in my, can you hear me okay? All right. I just noticed a change in the sound of the microphone. I'm going to make sure I'm okay there. So Habakkuk is complaining about this, and God comes in and says, listen, I got it under control. And by the end of the book, you see Habakkuk praising and glorifying God for who he is and how he works. As you come back to chapter 37 of Genesis, I invite you to turn there. What I want us to begin to see in the next couple weeks is that despite the sins of man, God exercises full and complete sovereign control over all things, including man's sin. He uses it for his glory. It's one of the main themes of Romans 8:28, that God can take anything and use it for good, for his glory, including the sinfulness of man. And when you take a look at Genesis chapter 37, it is the only hope that we see for that chapter. We will see in the coming weeks the sin of man, the plan of God revealed, the participation of man's sin in the plan of God, and the mourning and its place in our life. We will get no further than point 1 today, the sin of man, because as we look at this text, it's ugly. If you were to see my Bible on my iPad here, I went through, and in any place where there was sinfulness of mankind, I highlighted it in a particular color. I feel like I just highlighted the whole chapter, basically. And we're going to look at the sinfulness of man and what is going on in this text, because unless we take time to consider what's going on, we won't fully appreciate how God takes it and uses it for his glory. So let's take a look at Genesis chapter 37, and we're going to begin in verse 1, and we're just going to read down through. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. Now these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that the father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. And he said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brother said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us?" And so they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream, and he told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I've dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come and bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept these things in mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their flocks near the father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to them, "Here I am." And so he said to them, "Go now and see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." And so he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And he found a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock?" And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" And so Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. Now they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come, let us kill him and throw him in a pit. And then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what becomes of those dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands by saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him in one of the pits here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. And let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to the father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to pieces." And then Jacob tore his garments and put on sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. One look at this text, and all you see is the proliferation of sinfulness and wickedness that is continuing to affect the life of Jacob and his family, of Israel and his family. And once again, we return to this issue of favoritism, of partiality. Anybody remember where we first saw this? I've seen a couple different places, but anybody remember in our study so far, where have we seen favoritism and partiality so far? Jacob and Esau, right? Where else do we see it? Cain and Abel. Rachel and Leah. Notice that of those three examples, two of them are directly impacting Jacob's life. And once again, we see it here in this narrative. And I would suggest that of all the sins in this narrative, it is the sin of sins. It is the one that gives birth to the rest that we're seeing. And it is a terrible, terrible sin. We see it being once again regurgitated and repeated in the sins and the youth of the family. It started with Isaac and Rebekah favored one child each, right? That created the controversy and the tension. We see it creating a lot of tension between Jacob and his family and his two wives and their children. And yet now we still see this impact coming true. Little side note, little sidebar for you this morning, that is often true, isn't it? The sins of the parents often get translated down to the sins of the kids. I want to just show you a couple things from Scripture just to speak to this, to warn us. I think there's a real warning in it. In Exodus chapter 20 and verse 4, we see, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I am the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." There's that statement in there about visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. What does that mean? Does that mean that God punishes our children for my sins? Not according to Deuteronomy 24:16, which says, "Fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin." So what does it mean then in Exodus when he says he visits the iniquity of the children, of the fathers and the children of the third and fourth generations? I believe what that means is that the sins of the father tend to be repeated in the sins of the children and the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, in a continuously perpetual cycle. Now, by God's grace, that cycle can and is often destroyed, but the fact of the matter is, what that means is that oftentimes the failures and the sins of the father don't get corrected in their children, and it perpetuates for generations. One commentator explains it this way, that this explanatory section of the second commandment, with the assertion that God is jealous, punishing the children for the sins of the father, has been widely misunderstood. It does not represent an assertion that God actually punishes an innocent generation for sins of a predecessor generation, contrary to Deuteronomy 24:16. Rather, this oft-repeated theme speaks of God's determination to punish successive generations for committing the same sins they learned from their parents. In other words, God will not say, I won't punish this generation for what they were doing to break my covenant, because after all, they merely learned it from the parents who did it too. Instead, God will indeed punish generation after generation to the third and fourth if they continue to do the same sorts of sins that prior generations did. If the children continue to do the sins their parents did, they will receive the same punishments as their parents. And that's exactly what we see happening in this text, isn't it? The sin of Isaac and Rebekah, their favorites and their partiality, has been translated down again and again in the life of Jacob. And it is creating a massive mess that we see in this chapter. I want to remind us, turn with me to James chapter 2 for a minute, that this favoritism and partiality has absolutely no place in our life. James chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, says, "My brothers, show no partiality as you hold faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, "You sit here in this good place," while you say to the poor man, "You, stand over there," or "Sit here at my feet," have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you are called? Rhetorical question doesn't require an answer. The answer is yes. Listen, this idea of favoritism and partiality, if we have not learned it by now, we need to understand that it has absolutely no place in the life of a believer. Because it is terrible. Let me point out three things that when you treat with favoritism, what happens? And I'm completely ignoring my PowerPoint behind me, so sorry if you're using that. When we act with favoritism or partiality, we play God. Well, you ask, how do you do that? You are assigning value to someone's life that is not your place to do. When we treat with favoritism or partiality, we have, as James puts it, made distinctions amongst ourselves and become judges with evil thoughts. We have determined that this life is more important than this life. And we have just dishonored this life and this image of God that bears the same intricate value, intrinsic value, as this life. We have just taken and determined amongst ourselves which life is more valuable. And who has given us such authority to do so? Certainly not God. And that's exactly what he has done here in this passage of James when they treat the rich man better than the poor man. We don't have that right to make that distinction. The second thing that we do is that we also play on our selfish passions. Think about it for a minute. Why would you treat someone with partiality? With favoritism? You can give me an answer. Why? Why do you treat one person more favorably than another? What's one reason? You get something back from them. Anybody have another one? You like them better? Your own comfort. We treat people with favoritism because of the benefit they supply to us, don't we? They make us feel good. They have same interests, so we feel better about them. We like them better. They have a benefit to us. That rich man might be able to pad my comfort or make my life more comfortable or give the good Christmas gifts, right? You know. Whereas the poor man, what does he have to offer you? We treat people with favoritism because of what benefit they give to us. Whether it's simply a good feeling, we just like being around them, we like talking about them, they make us feel comfortable, they make us feel loved, they're just good looking, they're talented, their popularity maybe increases my popularity, right? Or maybe it is physically, financially, they give us some physical, tangible benefit. That's typically why we treat people with favoritism. If you look at Genesis 37, verse 3, we're told that Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Why does he love him more than his sons? We're told because he was the son of his old age. I find it interesting that that's the reason given. Because the real reason, that's probably part of it. But one of the reasons, I believe, is that it was the son of his favorite wife, right? And yet, it took a long time because God closed her womb because of the jealousy and envy and tension between her and Leah. And it took a long time for her to actually have children, for God to open up her womb to allow that child to be born. But it's interesting that that's the primary reason. It was the son of his old age. But I believe that being the son of his favorite wife was probably part of it too, right? And so what benefit does he receive? Well, maybe remembrance of his wife who's now dead, right? She passed away giving birth to Benjamin. Favorite wife, favorite son, memory of her, that significance. The sentiment and love and devotion that was given to his wife really gets translated to his sons, both of them, his two favorite. You see that later on as the story of Joseph and his life unfolds. Whatever it is, it played to Israel's selfish passions. And the third thing that I think happens when we treat with favoritism and partiality is that we show lack of love or care for one another upon the person whom we shower with our favor. It's not loving to show someone favoritism, to shower them with our affection. And here is how I want to point this out to you out of the text. Genesis 37:2. Joseph, being 17, was passionate flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report to their father. Now, we don't know whether this is just Joseph being a little bit of a tattletale, a little bit of a know-it-all, a little bit of a, father's favorite child, and I'm just tattling on my brothers. Could be. Possibly. In Genesis 37, verse 13 to 14, we see once again that Israel says to Joseph, your brothers are passionate flock at Shechem. I will send you to them so that you can go and tell me, is it well with them? So not only is Joseph bringing a bad report at one point, and we don't know whether that's legitimately a bad report or whether he was making it up. We don't know the real context of that. He's still a boy, a youth. But now we see his father sending him to check in on his brothers, right? To find out why. Now, mind you, how would you guys like it if you were, and some of those brothers are probably twice his age, if your little baby brother's the one coming and reporting of you to your father, right? You can already tell this is a recipe for disaster. But gets even more perspective when we understand that, of course, Joseph is the favorite child, and what did Israel do to prove that? He made him a coat of many colors. Now, it's interesting because as you look at this, many of the commentators and biblical scholars are still kind of unsure exactly what that color coat looked like. Was it really many colors? Was it, some say it wasn't really so many colors, but it was a full-length coat, represented position of authority, of favoritism. And what many have come to believe and conclude is that possibly that jacket wasn't just a coat that represented Israel's favor upon him, but it was a coat that represented his position of authority within the home. That Joseph, at 17 years of age, could have very possibly been in a managerial position over top of his brothers, which would not sit well if you were the oldest child or you were the older brothers. And what I think this all explains to us is when you get down to verse 5 and verse 9, when Joseph has his dreams and he runs and he tells his brothers and his daddy about the dreams. My perspective, you may disagree with me, my perspective is that it's probably done in a bit of a tone of bragging and foolish, immature arrogance, at the very least. He has these dreams. And you might say, it was just innocent. He didn't know what he was doing. He was just excited about these dreams, right? You might make that case if you only had verse 5, if you only had the first dream. He has this dream and he tells them and they hate him more and they rebuke him and they scorn him. And then he goes and has a second dream. I don't think Joseph was an idiot, do you? I think he was smart. I think he understood the tensions that existed in his family because of all of this. The second dream, after he comes and shares the first dream, and they already scorn him more, and they dislike him even more, he knows he's daddy's favorite. The coat proves it. They already know they're upset because he keeps bringing bad reports. That second dream, and the bragging of that second dream, I think just indicates to me that he is just doing this out of a immaturity, a foolishness that we don't see later in his life as you look at the text. But why is he doing this? Because he knows he's daddy's favorite. See, I think that oftentimes what happens is when we shower favoritism and partiality upon somebody, it boosts their own sinful pride and arrogance and puts them in a place of endangering themselves. It does not do them any favor to favor them. It only builds a sinful ego that then lords it over others. as their own means of promoting themselves. And it becomes a perpetuating thing if it is not rebuked. You look at the rest of this text, in verses 4 and 8, we see that this favoritism has resulted in a hatred of Joseph. There is in verse 4 and verse 8, they says they hated him all the more for it. This is hate, scorn, foe, enemy. This is not a light word. I mean, it's such a word that they are willing to murder their own brother over it. That's the conversation around the campfire as he approaches them wherever they're shepherding this flock at, and they want to actually physically end his life. This is not just a dislike, an annoyance. This is a full-blown hatred that's willing to seriously contemplate murder. We'll see him later. They strip him of his robe. They put him in a hole without any food or water, ignoring him, even though he begs and pleads with them. And we find that out from Genesis 42:21, when he says, even though he pled with us and begged with us, we ignored him. They were willing to throw him in a hole and ignore him and treat him as if he was nothing more than an enemy that they cared nothing about. Hatred spurned by their own father's preferential treatment, their own hurt that their father doesn't love them in the same way, and by his own boasting and bragging as an immature young man. That hatred, scorn, turns into malice and slander. Verse 4 says they could not speak peacefully to him. Their speech became hateful. Every mean thing they could possibly conjure up, they slung at him to tear him down, to cause pain, to build themselves up, to make themselves feel better. Their words were anything other than loving and gracious. They were as mean as possible, as mocking as possible. Which again tells me Joseph was not an idiot. He did not miss the fact that they did not like him, that his boasting about the dreams was not going to produce a positive effect. And in the light of this, it is only Reuben that really saves his life. Reuben and Judah, the two of them. And it's interesting that Reuben, out of all of them, would be the one who would want to say, let's not kill him. He's the oldest, the one who's probably be most threatened by Joseph being elevated to that position. But you also have to remember, what did Reuben do at the end of the last chapter that he's probably now out of favor with his father? He slept with his father's concubine. In Reuben's mind, he's probably thinking, this might be a good way for me to get back in to good graces with my dad. We don't know his motivation, his intent, but we know he is not in good favor with his father at this point in time. But we see this hatred and this malice being poured out upon their brother. As I already mentioned in verses 5 and 9, we see this bragging and this boasting. Joseph's status amongst his brother gave him some clout and some authority, and he was looking at his identity and his worth and his value in the position of favored and his position of authority over his brothers, possibly, if that's what that coat meant. And it resulted in that boasting and that bragging, which also then sparks a great jealousy from his brothers in verse 11. They were jealous of him. And we spent a long time back in chapter 30 considering this issue of jealousy and envy between Rachel and Leah. We even spent an entire week building our battle plan against jealousy and envy in our life, and how do we guard our hearts against it, because it is a very real thing and a very real danger for us in our lives today. We see the devastation of it. And we see that it's being provoked because of this this favoritism, this partiality that is happening within the context of this family. Which we also understand in verse 18 then leads to that intent to murder. You have to wonder, think about this. We all probably have people that we don't care for, right? If we're honest. People that annoy us a little bit, that we like to try to avoid if we see them in the grocery store. There might even be people that we absolutely just can't stand, that are obnoxious and we just really dislike them. They push all of the wrong buttons every time you're around them, right? Those button pushers. But how deep does that hatred have to go when you start to consider murder? And when that someone is your own flesh and blood, you understand the devastation of what happens when you allow hatred and anger to go unaddressed in your life. It cannot be understated. Because when it reaches the level of bitterness, you are hopelessly lost. God can overcome it, but it is so much harder when it has rooted into your life as bitterness. Because you don't want to change it. You like your hatred. You have to imagine these brothers probably sitting around laughing and joking about all the ways they might actually kill him. Making fun of it. Again, mocking, verse 19, which really could have been with slander, malice. But it just continues as they mock him. They call him, oh, here comes that dreamer, right? Making fun of him. Verse 20, we see lying. Of course, if you're going to murder somebody and you want to be still in good graces with your dad, your family, you got to lie to cover it up, right? Sin, by necessity, involves lying because you have to cover your tracks. Unless they want to be found out, lying has to be part of this plan to cover it up. And the kicker is they still do, and they cover it for many years until they finally land in Egypt, and suddenly their lie catches them. You have to wonder how on earth they live with themselves for all those years. What's even more disturbing is the thing that didn't even bother them because of their level of hatred. Listen, lying is never a small thing. Lying is never innocent. It's never okay. It's never acceptable. It's never harmless. Verse 23, we see their sin reaching epic proportions when they abuse him, they thieve from him, they take his coat, they abduct him, they throw him into this hole. By the way, I don't think this was gentle. This wasn't like, hey, David, come over here, let's take your jacket off, we'll give you a foot massage and make you feel all good about yourself, right? This they were mocking and slandering him as he came near, and as they came near, it likely resulted in a tuffle. Oh, you stupid little, this coat, and they start tugging on it, and then suddenly you have multiple guys involved, maybe all 12 of them there, and they're probably kicking, and probably punching, and probably scratching, and I don't think he came out unscathed. And then it says they threw him in a pit that he couldn't get out of. This is a pit that was dug out for rainwater to fill, to water the animals at certain times of year. It happened to be dry right now, but it's one he can't get out of, which means, and I don't think they just gently lowered him into it, they probably threw him in, which means he has bruises and jarring from hitting the ground with great force. He's without his outer coat. So now he's probably cold, being in the earth under the cold. They sit down themselves then around the fire to eat their food, and they talk and laugh and carry on, ignoring his plights, while they decide what on earth they want to do with this little braggart that they can't stand. All of this spurred on because he was Daddy's favorite, and everyone knew it. And then chapter 38, which really sets us up for the remainder of Joseph's life. And with the plan that God is going to do, Judah pops into the picture and says, you know what, let's not shed, he's our own flesh and blood, let's not have his blood on our hands. Instead, let's just sell him as a slave. And they have no idea what the life of a slave is probably going to look like. They pull him up. As these traders come by, they sell him, and we're told he goes into Potiphar's house. In chapter 38, we're going to step away from Joseph for a little bit as we talk about Judah and his family a little bit, and then we come back to him later on. Not a pretty picture, not a pretty chapter, is it? All sins of mankind that we sit back and we go, God, it's not fair, it's not just, it's not right, and yet God is sovereign over it. We will see it in the weeks ahead as we see what God does in an astounding way in the life of Joseph, using man's sin to accomplish his plan. It does not make sense to us, and yet here it is. Because there is very little in this chapter when it refers to humanity that is glowing and beautiful and nice. It is sin after sin after sin after sin, beginning with favoritism and partiality and provoking every other sin that you can possibly imagine. And yet, because we know the story, the sovereignty and the control and the awesomeness of God hovers over this text. But we have to come and wrestle with this. We're living in a day when wickedness is flourishing. When people are fearful. The future is uncertain. We know there's going to be hard times. We know what's going to come. We know the sinfulness of man is going to bear down upon this nation, and we are going to see wickedness expound more and more, and we are going to have to wrestle every single day with the wickedness of man and how God is still yet completely and sovereignly control over it all. None of it escapes his power or attention. Despite the sins of man, you know what? PowerPoint. Despite the sins of man, God exercises full control over all things. It's going to get beautiful from here as we continue the study of the text and see how God works with this. But I want to end with this quote. It's one that I have read a number of times, and I have come to appreciate the truth of it. Here is the secret of divine all-sufficiency. To come to the end of our everything in ourselves and in our circumstances. When we reach this place, we stop asking for sympathy because of our hard or situation or bad treatment, for we will recognize these things are the very conditions of our blessing, and we will turn from them to God and find in them a claim upon Him. Probably all of us can point to hurts and offenses and bad situations in our life that don't make sense, that we think are unfair, unjust, unkind, unloving. Do you see God's hand in it for His glory and our good? Can you rest upon that truth? There will not be a shortage of sins against us. There won't be a shortage of hurts, of crimes, and it will not be a shortage of what appears to be injustices that are not matched by the God of heaven. There'll be plenty of reasons for us to sit back and echo Habakkuk's cry, "Why, God, do you let me see sin? Why is justice not satisfied? Why are you allowing it?" And we have to rest upon the truth that God has it completely under control. And we trust Him. We rest in it, no matter the sins of man. Next week, we turn back to this passage as we consider the plan of God revealed and the participation of man's sin in that plan. And it is glorious indeed to behold. Father, help us. As we think about this text, it is bleak, it's dark, it's ugly. The sins of man are a proliferation and an abomination in this world, and yet you, God, have not lost control. And we have to wrestle with that truth, the same as Habakkuk did, the same as many of the biblical writers and men and women of Scripture do. Your timing is not our timing. Your ways are not our ways. And while it may look at times as if these sins of man go unchecked, we know there's coming a day in your perfect plan and will when you will unfold your perfect justice, and it couldn't be improved upon. Father, I pray you help us to rest upon that truth, that you guard our hearts against these sins, that the sins of the fathers would be severed by the power of grace in our life, that it would not be perpetuated to the second and third and fourth and fifth generations, and that we would sever it now by your grace and your power. But may we stand upon your grace and your truth and trust that even when those sins are perpetuated and wickedness abounds, you, Abba, are in complete control. We love you and we thank you. We pray this in your name. Amen.